Hey everyone, welcome back to the new episode of Road to Rust. In this episode, we will be learning about structs in Rust programming language. First of all, we will be opening our code, or we can say our first project, which we have created, named as DAC in a VS Code editor. Then we will be installing some of the extensions which will help us throughout our coding using a Rust programming language. So let's get started and open our code project in a VS Code editor. So let's open our project in a VS Code editor. For that, we need to locate, or we can say enter a path in our Windows terminal. Then we will enter code dot, and when we press enter, it will open a Visual Studio Code editor. For this, you will need to install a Visual Studio Code editor in your Windows. So now let's start with installing some of the extensions which will help us by doing for writing a code in Rust. So let's come into the extension tab, and here we can see that we have a lot of extensions installed, but for our programming we need to install three of them. Rust syntax, which will help you to highlighting, or we can say improve the Rust syntax, and a Rust analyzer, which will help you with the annotations and other type of stuff throughout your coding journey with Rust programming language. So now, after installing these, let's open our Explorer, and now we can see that we have a project tree which contains source directory, target directory, git ignore, cargo log, and cargo toml file. So let's ignore these at the moment and let's click on the source. Now we can see there is a main.rs file. So the main.rs file contains a code which we have seen in our previous video, which prints hello world. So this is a main function definition. So the main function plays a very important role in throughout the Rust programming language. This is the part which executes first whenever we run our Rust code. So we can see that there is a function print ln, and or we can say a print line ln as a short and an exclamation mark. So the exclamation mark is a macro, and let's don't dive into the macro right now. So as take it as it's a macro is a function which will help which help us in our whole coding journey. So as we can see that there is a string passed in a print ln function which was printing on our command line. So now if we just add a single quotes, so the single quotes are represents a character, but a print line function needs a double quotes, which means or which represent strings in our code. So now let's come back to our main thing which we will be going to learn in this video. So the main focus which we have is to create a DAC object. So we want why we want to create a DAC object? Because we want to store some data and attach a functionality to it to use that data. To store data in our Rust programming language, the best thing which we will be using is struct. So what are structs? Structs are a kind of a class in other languages which help us to we can say have some data and some functionality attached to that data. So let's create our first struct using our Rust programming language, and let's jump to the VS Code editor. So let's define our first struct in our code editor, or we can say in our main.rs file. So here we will be using struct, and then name our struct as a deck, and then let's open our curly braces, and then we will be defining a list which will hold our card data. So we will be seeing cards and colon, and let's say vec, and vec contains strings in it. So this is how our first struct is defined in our Rust programming language. So here we can see there is a lot of things, or we can say a lot of syntax going on. So let's break it down into a diagram, and which will help us to understand a struct in a better way how it works in a Rust programming language. So now let's see the diagram and try to understand how the structs define in a Rust. So let's say the first thing is our deck. So the name of the struct is always capitalized, which means it will always start with a capital letter. And then we can see that there is a vector which we have defined in our struct, which is a list of fields, or we can say a list of data which is wrap up around, or we can say stored inside our struct. And then we can see the vector, which a templatized type, which is a string. So the vector contains a list of strings. So why we have used a vector here? Yes, the Rust programming language also contains the array, but the array needs to be defined, or we can say we need to pass the size of the array before, or we can say that before the compilation of the program. It can't grow and shrink during a runtime of a program, but the vector contains, or we can say vector contains that type of functionality, or we can say property which can grow and shrink in size. They are like an array which contains the data, but they can grow and shrink at the same time. Let's create a first instance of our DAG object. So let's create or declare a variable, let's say DAG, and let's create a first object of our struct DAG. So we will be saying DAG and then open a curly braces, and inside it it's a card, so we need to create an empty vector. Let's say card, and we will be saying vec exclamation mark, which is again a macro, and at the end let's put a semicolon. So here we can see this is a DAG annotation coming on our VS Code editor. So this will tells you that what this variable contains, or what type of data it contains inside of it. If we have set it up a string, then it will be showing a string. So this is just to help to see that what type of data we are storing it. If we, for example, if some of the people can't see on their VS Code editor, we can define this on our own as well. So which means that we have defined it that it will contain a value of a DAG object, right? So now let's remove it, and let's see into the diagram for the syntax that we have written on our screen to have a more clear understanding of it. So here we are on the diagram, and it will explain it that how we have created our first object using our struct. So first of all, we have used a let. So the let help us to create a DAG variable, or we can say a variable which holds our DAG object. Then we have a struct literal, or we can say which will help us to create this whole creates an instance of a struct. Then this is a type annotation which will help us to describe the type of value DAG, like what type of a value stored inside our variable. And this thing in the end, which is a vec exclamation mark, which is a macro, and a empty brackets, which creates an empty vector, and the exclamation mark indicates a macro. So now let's try to print our object that which we have created just now. So let's use this print line, and let's say here is our first DAG object, and here we will be using we can say the curly braces, which we can say it as a placeholder, and then let's put a comma and a DAG. Right, now let's save our file. So now we can see that there is an error which popping out that we can't use, or we can say to like there is some issue in printing our DAG object. So now let's hover to our error, which showing us a lot of information, which is the good thing about the Rust, which shows you a very good amount of information that what type of error is showing and how can we solve that error. So now we are seeing that the tag doesn't implement FMD display. The trait is not implemented for tag. It doesn't make any sense for the moment, and we can say in format string you may be able to use this or this for pretty string or for pretty print. So it's all about which we can assume, or we can say we can getting from the error message is that there is an error of some type of formatting, So let's add a colon, and we can see again now we need to add a question mark. So now when we hover it again and when we save the file, we can see that this error is still there. So now let's hover it again. Now it's saying that DAC doesn't implement debug. The thread debug is not implemented for DAC. Add this to DAC or manually implement debug for DAC. So now let's add hashtag, and let's say hash, not a hashtag, hash, and let's say derive, and let's say debug. Now when we save our code file, we can see that the error got disappeared. So now let's run our project and see that our object get printed or not. So now we are here at the command terminal, or we can say a terminal. We can use the VS Code terminal as well, but as we are using this terminal for our project, or we can say for all of our tutorials, so I'm using the same terminal, and let's type here cargo build to first build our project. As we can see that there are some warning. So these are the warning that our struct field is never used, like a field card is never used. So ignore these warnings at the moment, and let's say cargo run. When we hit enter, so we can see that it printing here is our first stack object, and it's printing our empty object. So now we have a little bit of confusion that this derived debug which we have added in our top of our struct will solve all the error. So what's all the magic happens behind the scene of just adding this single line and the error got disappeared. So let's take a help of our diagram and break it down and understand that what is derived debug. So let's take a look to our diagram which have been broken down into the pieces to understand this derived debug statement. So the derive is an attribute, or we can say this whole statement is a attribute for this DAC struct, which gives some extra instruction to the compiler. So the derive attribute tells the compiler that we will be adding some extra functionality to our struct, and the type of that functionality or a trait of that functionality will be a debug. So this is a, we can say, a attribute which help us to add a functionality to our DAC to keep this simple. So this is all about the structs, to define structs, and how we can print our struct, and how we can create a struct, initialize our struct in a Rust programming language. I hope you have learned a lot about structs in a Rust programming language, and in the next video we will be learning about adding a functionality to our struct. So thank you guys for watching this video. I hope you like the video and learn a lot about structs. Thank you guys. Keep watching my channel and do subscribe.